Works on Zoom and works for everyone here. Great. Thank you for inviting me, Ranjit and Ishil, for the Ken McMillan Celebration. The work I'll talk about today is in collaboration with Sharad Malik and our group of students, many of whom listed here have actually already graduated, but we're still going to call them all Princeton students. Okay. So, of the many things you'll hear about Ken's contributions to, I was trying to think about what to, and of course, needless to say, his work has influenced a lot of my own work. We were contemporaries at CMU, and so I had to choose which of the things that I'd like to talk about. And as some of you who might know me, I've been on this bandwagon for doing compositional reasoning for a little bit of time now. And so I decided I'm going to talk about his really excellent work and inspiring work on compositional verification, which started about 30 years ago. This was the first paper I could find. And I do remember, because I attended so many CAVs, the talk that he had presented. And this wasn't even the start. There were so many others with some of the people present here, including Ranjit. We go back to your unit of work and refinement-based processor verification. Uh, I was trying to find a figure, and I think it goes to the clarity with which Ken talks about. I found a lot of formulas, but not so many figures, because he doesn't want to hide behind figures to not have to say what these symbols mean. But I did manage to find one in one of his journal papers, which was, I suppose, a collection of some of his work by then on compositional verification. And the reason I'm showing the figure from this paper is because it mentions the things I'm going to talk about: the abstract model, the refinement relations, the implementation, and compositional refinement verification, which is central to what we need. So for me, one of the things that we had been looking in the last 5 or 6 years at Princeton was going back to hardware design, which became pretty interesting. And actually, this is a slide that was put together by one of my students for the latest, and maybe not the latest, it keeps getting old so fast. NVIDIA chip, which is like chip design is hotter than ever. There's a lot of programmable hardware accelerators because people want machine learning, they want vision. And so there's GPU, there's CPU clusters, and a lot of hardware accelerators, not just the GPU and the CPU. There's also compositional design, because when you have a lot of these modules talking with each other on the same chip for a systems on chip design, you need them to be talking with each other and communicating. So there's compositional design. And as a verification person, the question we asked is, where are the specifications? I mean, that's always the Achilles heel of trying to apply formal verification in practice. And more importantly, where are the abstractions? Because if you take that chip design, the system on chip with so many modules, it's hard to reason about them at the flat level of the RTL or the design that you get in terms of, let's say, Verilog. So this was a question that Sharad Malik's group was trying to address around the time I joined Princeton. And I think of it as addressing the specification gap, where they had started with the lessons from processor instruction set architecture, or ISA, as many of as is known in the field. And the nice thing about an ISA is that it specifies architecturally visible state by abstracting away microarchitectural details and so on. And the other nice thing is it's a modular specification, because you talk about what the hardware is doing in terms of a set of instructions, each one of which just looks at one view of what the hardware is doing. So we had this nice view, and what the ISA serves as is, for all the software stack above it, it serves as a hardware abstraction. So you get a software view of the hardware's functionality. It defines the semantics for software interacting with hardware, like in firmware or low-level systems, and it enables software verification. And going downward, you can think of it as providing a hardware specification, because then you can check your hardware implementations in RTL, register transfer level, Verilog designs, against that ISA specification, and it enables implementation verification. So taking this lesson from the ISA, Sharad and his group came up with what they called instruction level abstractions, or ILA. Instead of the ISA, it's an ILA. And the idea here, again, is that you're going to focus on architecturally visible state, and you're going to talk about what each instruction does in terms of updating the state in a state transition system. So we have now the ILAs, and this was work that we had published about 7 years ago. It took a lot of accelerators that people were designing, gave an ILA model view of what the hardware is doing. And for all of us, actually in an architecture or hardware conference, I may or may not show this slide, but I figured I'm very safe showing it to the CAV audience. I think of it as a state-based operational model for hardware, because in software and PL conferences, people are always using operational models. And in the hardware community, we don't always call them operational models. We think of them as finite state machines and so on. So really what you need to cover that gap from hardware to software at the interface is an operational model. And technically, it's really nothing but a set of vector variables, which in this case, we want them to focus on architecturally visible state, because that's what's going to give us the abstraction by hiding away other details that are at the mu architecture level. And the rest is very familiar. I'll just say that we also have a decode function and a next state update function, but this is per instruction. So that's what makes it more like an operational model rather than an RTL design at the hardware level. Okay, so we have the ILA now, and of course, one can do the standard kind of processor verification with an ILA model like we used to do with the ISA. And so we have an ILA queue and an RTL design at the lower level P, and the refinement check will check whether it's correct with respect to the specification. And this was, of course, inspired by classic processor verification efforts, including by Ranjit and Ken and many others. And just for those who may not have seen, it's kind of like the classic commutating diagram. Actually, David Dill was one of the first ones to use it in a CAV 94 paper, I think. Basically, starting from an arbitrary state that are corresponding, related by some refinement mapping. You want to make sure that executing the instruction at the ISA level and maybe taking more cycles at the RTL level, once they have finished, you want to check that the resulting states in the two are also related by your refinement mapping. So this was just classic work, but we used it for ILAs, which we are now going to use for not just processors, but also for accelerators. That was in our original paper. And we extended that idea of thinking about instructions for a hardware module in terms of the commands at the interfaces of hardware modules. And we extended this to consider general hardware modules in a subsequent paper. All of the references are here on the slide. So when the slides get presented, maybe compiled, you should be able to follow it if you're interested. But really, it was very much leveraging the processor verification efforts for this abstraction that we wanted to generalize to become more modern in terms of handling systems on chips. Of course, now, once you have this for a single module, you want to be able to compose them together and talk about refinement for their compositions. So we have an RTL module P1, another one P2, and let's say we've also developed their specifications Q1 and Q2, and you can perform locally each of the refinement checks. We next extended these checks to consider something we call the ILA interface checks, and think of it as additional obligations that we put on the communication between the modules. And what this gave us is we proved in an ICCAT paper about 3 years ago that this ensures compositional refinement. So you get formally a refinement relation in the compositions of the specification and the RTL designs. Of course, we did a paper and pencil proof that time, and I should say, I was telling Clark about it the other day. Actually, one of my students is now trying to formalize all of this in Lean and show this as a meta theorem, as a proof rule in Lean, because ideally, I want to be able to do these checks automatically, but with the soundness of the proof rule, be able to talk about the system being correct in the composition. So how does this relate to my title, which was actually going to talk about verification of protocol implementations? Systems on chip, modern ones, have many circuit modules. I showed you some pictures. Examples are, for example, the AXI bus, on-chip bus architecture, because protocols are used to ensure that these modules interact correctly with each other. There's also, we've heard several times about cache coherence. So there's a lot of cache coherence protocols that are implemented in hardware. And so here are some examples of those things. So protocol verification is one of the classic things that actually finite state systems, concurrent systems were very good. And they were the classic case studies in many of the early work on model checking. And often what you do there is what I would call property-based protocol verification. Let's say you have some protocol models, some finite state machine or interacting finite state machines, and you will first try and prove some high-level properties like no deadlock or mutual exclusion and things like that. And then you have these protocol implementations in these modern systems on chips that have hardware, in Verilog. And yes, you can try to prove those same properties that you've checked on your model on now the actual design implementation, but scalability can be challenging because the state space here is a lot bigger typically than the model that you might have on which you had checked those properties. So our focus was really trying to check the correctness of this implementation against this specification. So we didn't want to do just property-based verification, but really a specification-based verification of this implementation in hardware. And this is still a problem because there's a big gap and scalability can be challenging. So this motivated us to do something which I think Ken did a very good job in the 90s, late 90s. But I still remember his Tomasulo, the correctness proof for the Tomasulo algorithm for the processor, where he introduced many things in the abstraction. And for us, what we did was we used the ILA methodology to divide the problem into two tasks. We covered this large gap by introducing ILA models in between the two, so that on one side, you could show the sequential equivalence against the protocol specification, which you had in terms of finite state machines and the regular stuff that we all know and love. And because the ILA modules were at a reasonably high level, architecture level, it was okay to use current tools like Jasper Gold and all of the good stuff, BDD-based symbolic model checking, interpolant-based model checking, in the commercial tools that are available these days in order to perform that sequential equivalence, which then left the burden on doing the refinement plus interface checking, which I think of it as component checking against each of the modules. So this seemed like, yeah, this would work. And it did. We created, and because what we wanted was really that the sequential equivalence checking problem is still global, but it's at a much higher level. It doesn't have the huge state space that's there in the RTL design. For the RTL design and the architecture level specification, you are able to check it on a per component level. So that's what we was motivating us in order to do it modularly per component checks, hopefully more scalable. And thankfully, it did work out. We took a few examples of the actual protocols people use. There was one for an off-chip communication protocol used in base jump STL. This was by Mike Taylor's group at UW. And essentially, it was the RTL design had three main modules, and there was communication between those modules. In this case, I think, if I recall correctly, they were serializing the data of 128 bits into, I think, 4 bits, 4 words of 32 bits each or something like that. But the interesting thing I'd like to point out is, unlike the top-down refinement that was very popular earlier and that you saw some in the earlier talks, for us to, I think Shah's made that point that in many cases he went upward from the design. And so what worked for us was, again, given the RTL design for each module, bottom up, we came up with the ILA model as a specification for it. And in many cases, we were able to complete the verification, as in putting together the sequential equivalence check plus each of the component checks using modern EDA tools, including Jasper Gold. So, for those of you who are interested, you can follow the paper. We described the effort done for the AXI protocol, for an off-chip link protocol that I just showed, for some cache coherence protocols that were done by a group at Princeton in an open Python project. And all of these, actually, some of these had bugs, and we were able to, using this methodology with component checks, find the bugs, confirm with the designers, and so on. One might ask, where do these ILA models come from? And I have to admit that for many of these works, we actually developed them, the students developed them manually. And we did provide support using a domain-specific language actually embedded in C++ for the iLang framework, which at least automated all the rest. Once you put the specification in, the job of translating it into refinement check obligations was done by automatically converting them into assertions in SVA, which was then used by any of the tools. And a lot of this is actually available in the iLang framework that's there. I should add that we also looked into how to extract them automatically from RTL designs. And you can think of it as verified lifting using syntax-guided synthesis. And for this, there are two main steps that we needed. Step one is to identify architectural state variables, those that are visible, and really it's state that is persistent across the instructions. Instructions, again, is not just the processor instruction, but your view of the commands at the interface of a hardware module, which results ultimately in some state update. And step two was extracting then, once you identify architectural state variables, and in a paper we showed how to do that soundly. So we sometimes over approximate them, but that's okay. That just means you have a bigger model than strictly necessary, but at least it is sound. And then in step two, we extracted from the given RTL and Verilog the next state update function for each state variable. And it's always there. It's like, yes, you have to do existential quantification. Interestingly, the student actually did it all using LLVM. And so really it was extracting it from the RTL Verilog and then doing a lot of simplification using LLVM passes to simplify the resulting expression to get the next state function. So that's pretty much the technical part that I wanted to say. I did want to say that it hasn't been mentioned here so far. I know that we all love the intellectual contributions, but let me also say, since I joined the steering committee, I've also realized that Ken is Mr. CAV. I don't know, I used to, as a graduate student, that was the Dr. CAV? Okay. I used to think of Bob Kurshan as being Mr. CAV because when I was a graduate student, he was everywhere and he commanded with his booming voice the law at CAV. And since he stepped off the steering committee, I have to really thank Ken for taking on that mantle because I think what Ranjit said, that CAV may not have existed, I think that's literally true, at least for the last 10 plus years, because only now am I beginning to take on some of the work that Ken has been silently and without any complaints doing for the last 10 years. And I'm telling you, it's a lot. So I think the whole CAV community owes a ton of gratitude to Ken for being willing and stepping up to do all this. Thank you, Ken. I'm very sure it wouldn't have, CAV wouldn't have happened for the last 10 plus years. And who knows for the future if Ken weren't doing it. Also reflecting a little bit on my own research journey, I mentioned I was at CMU, and I too remember Ken's magical summer of the Encore Gigamax. Actually, I thought it was in 89, but I could be wrong. Maybe the paper was published in 90, but Ken can correct me later. What I remember is that after he came back, Professors Ed Clark, Randy Bryant, and Alan Fisher, who was actually my advisor, offered a course on model checking in the fall semester. And I had only learned about logic in the semester before. I had never seen logic before. And right after Ken's magical summer, they talk about BDDs, they talk about model checking, they show how it can be done automatically. And I loved it. I liked it so much better than the SIMD architecture work I was doing with Alan. So I switched to BDD-based verification. And to be honest, I really just wanted to finish my PhD thesis. That's it. And that's what I thought I would do. I thought I'd be done with formal verification after my PhD and just move on. And that just goes to show how little I knew. So, Ken, thank you for the fun ride that is still ongoing after 30 plus years. It's really with all your contributions, with the inspiration, and actually the CAF community that has kept me going in terms of, and like you said, it is a paradigm, really. So it's not just the original model checking algorithm, but all that we have come to associate with it in all the ways that we use it. Thank you so much. Thanks. Here are some photos I found, so I'll leave you with that. This is from Ken's, I think that's with Karen Yorav, right? That's Karen Yorav at. That's it. That's from CAV 2008, because that was the last time I went around clicking a lot of photos. Yes, yes. And then this was at, I think, Ed's celebration that Limor had organized in Pittsburgh in 2014. Dave, you are here too. And there's Jerry Birch. Yeah.
Okay, we can have a few more minutes for questions, and in exactly 6 minutes we need to vacate this one.
Oh, sure. I think 6 minutes? Did I? Oh, okay.
Oh, you're fine.
So you talked about the visible architectural state, and kind of implies that the microarchitectural state is invisible.
It's invisible.
But now we know it is observable. That gives rise to a whole slew of side channel attacks.
Totally. And actually, we have a project on that too. I think I meant it for the purpose of software interacting with hardware. But yes, you're absolutely right. It is observable, and the threat models and all of that have to think about that. For the purpose of trying to lift it up to the software level, it was really software visible state that we were worrying about for this project. Yeah.
But I look at all these side channel attacks, and my conclusion is that essentially it dooms these architectures. They'll never be able to get around all the side channel attacks. They'll keep popping up.
I think what people are doing there, I know, is more like contract verification. So you do say something about the software side, and then for the hardware side, you talk about the microarchitecture, putting some assumptions on it, and then being able to prove things. We can talk, we can chat. We have one of the projects with Mangja Yan, who's at MIT, security expert, looking at contracts and shadow logic for microarchitecture. Yes, you're right. I think some of it is doomed, and we are still trying to figure out. And in any case, how design progresses is different from how the analysis progresses. Yeah.
Moshe kind of stepped on part of my question, so I don't want to be too redundant, but it's similar in that abstractions are leaky. And ISAs evolved sort of over time to sort of clean things up. So the hardware people suffer enormously to try to give a cleaner ISA.
Sure.
And in my experience with the accelerator space, that hasn't happened, and it's a mess. Your ILA currently seems almost like sort of combination, it's very clean. And if I-
Well, it's clean if you are interested in functional verification. I think if you're interested in security, you have to do other things. Okay?
Functional verification, if I
Yeah.
have, say, an accelerator, that, it has a latency of 20 cycles.
Yeah.
But I can issue a new one every, 4 cycles, except when something, you've seen this, and this
Yeah.
happened.
Yeah.
How do you see that? How, like, can you generalize to handle that? Do you think you can put pressure if it works well to make accelerators cleaner? Like, where is this going?
I think where it's going is just like the ISA has served many purposes and people have put things on top of it. It's like you said, it at least gives you a clean way to think about hardware functionality. As an operation, that's an obligation by the hardware for anybody who wants to reason about it. I think the thing that I was missing before the ILAs is that when you have just a Verilog RTL, yes, you can get FSM, but you don't have an operational view of what the hardware is doing, what functions it is providing. So it's literally a function view of when a software calls the hardware, what is it getting?
All right, let's thank Aarti
Thank
again.
you.